All right, so there's a new book, and the book is really about the troubled relationship between architecture and beauty. It's not really much about beauty. It's really mostly about the troubled relationship. The troubled relationship architects have between architecture and beauty, or appearance, or aesthetics, between architects and the self, or architects and the eye, or architecture and form and contents. And the trigger really is me growing up in Tel Aviv in a modernist city where people were really not interested in anything. It was a very socialist city, and people were really not interested in anything what it looks like. Anything to do with aesthetics was a kind of a self-indulgence, and most important was socialism and simple way of life. And the beauty of the white city of Tel Aviv was a cultural statement that shocked all her visitors in the early days. But paradoxically, the socialist mentality that's shared by most of its inhabitants, as an addition to the Jewish iconoclastic tradition, made them turn a blind eye to most visual sets of references. And it was the content that mattered. And there's a very common expression that we all use in Hebrew, or Israelis, it's very, very common, and which is in a kind of direct translation is don't look at the jar, but at its content. And there's a similar English expression, but the Hebrew one is really focused on the jar and the content. The jar, which is the outside, which is completely unimportant, but the content is important. And I grew up with that kind of expression in my phrase that everybody kind of use every second minute. But more than that, it was really used at home. And I was, since young age, I was really mocked at every day by my lovely Jewish intellectual father, who loved his daughter and wanted to rescue her, and was not comfortable with her attraction to what things look like, and really consider kind of shallow things. So it was an ongoing debate at home. Then took me then further. When I was a student of architecture in the 70s, it was really after I had a degree in science, which I had to do again to please my father. But then I kind of won the battle and got into architecture. But then in Jerusalem at that time, in the middle of the 70s, Christopher Alexander, the author of the pattern language, reducing architecture to a set of templates, was really the thing I had to deal with and to learn and how to use, and aesthetics was far from the debates and what we were educated for. Luckily, in the early 80s, I got to the AA, and Zaha won the peak, and the whole, each unit at the AA was really about what things look like, appearances, aesthetics. Of course, ethics was always there, but aesthetics and how we generate projects through appearance and discussing it was very much part of the debate, kind of looking at architecture as a cultural expression, as architecture as art. And so that was a project of mine when I was a fourth-year student, and trying to kind of deal with personal passions, which here was kind of silhouettes about low horizon. Briefly, we all remember that modernism started with kind of being inspired by the art world, by Mondrian, and German expressionism, which was kind of an ongoing thing before then, was kind of, it was the death of it. And when the Still came to power in 1917, individualism considered to be kind of a way of old world. And I always remember reading Pent about German expressionism, where he quotes the attitude towards the expressionists, which was the messianic attitude of the expressionists, seemed like mischief caprice, if not indeed inspired by the devil. And I think that kind of taboo started then and took us, and still with us, with a not with me, not with many, but with the psychology of many architects. So modernism started actually with an aesthetics, with an aspiration for an aesthetic in a very clear language, and but very short time, during the 30s, it was already the apologists versus the protagonists that kind of won the game, won the war, and the war of eliminating aesthetic bias, and that's how utilitarian how utility, the world of utility, came to architecture and became the dominant attitude. So through the 50s, we can see work like in England, which is very talked about by the Smithsons, where the world of utility kind of won the world of aesthetics, and how democracy's public opinion took over individual taste and power. So we're all familiar with that through the 40s and later. And basically, I think socialism, democracy, public opinion, the notion of public opinion, the perception of architects servicing society, the notion of objective limits and no subjective license, all the things that we're very familiar with kind of brought a certain psychology to the world of architecture. And also people argue that the attitude since alphabetic typography was kind of invented, and the printing was a possibility, and the world developed in such a way that it led to invention of perspective, the increased use of maps, and all that brought to abstraction in the visualization. And scientific progress also brought to the intellectualization of the process. So there were many, many reasons for why the world kind of moved that way during the 20th century. And some claim that there was a very short decade between the 77 to 1988 where there was a real change, and the change was that art and not design is the supreme mission of architecture. So we're all familiar with Gehry's family house, and also the notion again that, you know, being driven by painter, being driven by looking at painters' work, and if it's Gehry, if it's Zaha Hadid, who was influenced by Kazimir Malevich and the Supermatists, and Kop Himmelblau, who was very influenced by Viennese painter Arnold Reiner, and the whole world of, you know, emotions, feelings, and personal attitude found their way to architecture. But unfortunately, there was a second round of where the apologists kind of won the protagonist, but with the help of architects around, where it was the deconstructivist show in New York, where Mark Wigley was the curator, the major curator, and not only that he titled it with an enticing kind of name that was reminding Derrida, but he also, if one read the catalog, one can see the way he defined the work and twisted the meaning and kind of dismissed the notion of being expressive, and the role of self-expression in architecture. And but it's not just Wigley. What was astonishing is the way it caught like fire the architect's kind of imagination, and their thirst for Derrida, or for a body of objectifying knowledge, that kind of ambition was the thing that kind of shocked me again and again, how powerful it is, and how it would always bring to the fact that it reduced the place of the self and personal attitude. So there were other people who were exhibited in the MoMA show. It was Peter Eisenman and Bernard Tschumi, who were more affinities with the Derrida and deconstructivism, but more than half of the people who show in the show obviously were not interested in Derrida and in that kind of line of thought, which is always kind of, for me, a painful reminder of the battles between the romantics and the philosophers in the 18th century, and it kind of feels that it's kind of cycle of familiar attitude where there's always a problem when the human emotions are being liberated and introduced into creative work as in architecture. So this was 88, the beginning of the 90s, and in a way it's not surprising that when Lynn came with publishing, editing an AD, which was a kind of very unique magazine that entitled Folding. It was sold out fast. It was reprinted in 2004. It has a tremendous influence in a way because the kind of math and philosophy was behind Lynn at the time. And if, many other people dealt with foldings, but if you mention folding, most students will, and most people, I think, in the architectural discourse will actually attribute it to Lynn. And I think it's just a reflection on the way the architectural discourse is kind of moving forward. As I said, Ron Arad or Enrique Moraes that were folding. I had a project, an exhibition I did in '91, and I think it was not just me. It was in there. It was done. Parametric design was becoming a prominent and prevalent way of approaching architecture, and becoming a tool, becoming a media that kind of changed thinking of architects. And it's interesting to notice that a very influential figure like Bernard Cash, who influenced Lynn and Mark Goulthorpe and many others who were kind of leading in the architectural world at that time, leading the digital discussion, he came with a kind of similar statement as was against the German expressionist, where he said that the architect is an intellectual worker whose mode of production is increasingly governed by digital technologies, which are hostile to all approaches that perpetuate the age-old myth of the capricious architect-artist. And it's a very kind of a typical attitude. And so Goulthorpe was a very influential figure in London, definitely, and he was very touched by Cash. He collaborated with Cash, and had an ambition to kind of reduce the self, to let the self kind of evaporate, and content became kind of fused with form. In London, John Fraser was a very influential figure. He published a book in evolutionary architecture. It was published in '95, but actually John Fraser was very active at the AA from the 60s, 70s, and actually got a unit in the 90s. What always struck me is that evolutionary architecture had, as an approach, had developed the logic of the genetic code was actually borrowed to generate form. But if one is looking at their work in 68, it looks like the work in 68. In 94, it looks very much like the work around in 94. And I don't know how much the genetic code was. It was a kind of fascinating metaphor and a way of thinking, and even activating a system. But where natural selection work in nature, I always claim that when it's with computer, it's the eye which is creating the selection, which is always a problem. Meanwhile, the digital architects did very well, and Lynn is one of them, and actually the work, I think, as well got very, more and more interesting, but it's still was considered as a result of calculus sensibility, or as named after then parametric sensibility, where there were certain preferences for continuous surfaces and volumes, which is a lot to do with calculus. Interestingly, I found it very interesting that within the digital architects, there was a kind of, among some of them, there was a craving to bring back intuition and self-expression into actually the digital system, and into a system where people work with computer and devise specific technique to actually involve the self as well. So as a phenomenon, I think it's also kind of very, very telling. some years later, in conversation with Greg Lynn, he actually shifted, and like some others, and shifted his views and admitted that the inherent anti-subjectivity kind of attitude was not, didn't appeal to him anymore, and actually he treated the digital medium as a medium and not necessarily as a pseudo scientific way of having a progressive way of thinking through architecture. Diaz Alonso, the way I see Hernan Diaz Alonso within the digital scene is kind of, he turned the whole scene upside down, where image was very important, not just the geometry and the form making, where the final aesthetic was very important, and more than anything else was his personality and the individual taste and understanding was kind of an attitude came into the very digital process. So I know you were all, not all of you, but I know here in SCI-Arc there was a big lecture yesterday, 2 nights ago, and Patrik Schumacher suggested that after modernism, as a universal style, come parametricism as a universal style, moving on from utility to technique, from modernism to parametricism. And I think the reason why I did the book is kind of the fear of that kind of attitude of, again, as I explained it already by now, removing the self, removing the emotions, removing ourselves from the very process of generating architecture. And for years, like, people used to say, it's all in your head, there's no, it's bullshit, it's not. But actually, the parametric kind of sensibility, if we'll give it the title of sensibility, is infectious and is taking, I don't think it takes over, but it's very popular in Tel Aviv, in London, in Beijing. What kind of surprised me, you kind of, one doesn't believe one's ear, but style and aesthetics have to do with imagery, and image is a psyche, and the psyche is imagination. That's psychologists claim and say and confirm. So style is a serious matter, and as a reflection on our inner world. So it's kind of strange where Patrik, in his world, mentioned neoclassicism. Art Nouveau was not mentioned, too short, not important, of course, because it was with personal attitude. He mentioned modernism as their style of the 20th century, where German expressionism was not there, not important, very short. Deconstructivism, not important, very short. I think it's very, for me, it's very, when I hear that, I think it's very dangerous, because for me, these short periods are the most important periods. And as the world, as we started living in the 21st century, I think those short periods and what actually they stand for and what is behind them, these are the most important moments. But we might be surprised, some of you might not be surprised, some are surprised by Schumacher's definition of the world of architecture today. I was very surprised when I heard a cultural historian, Eric Hobsbawm, a very respected British historian. In 1994, not so long ago, he said, one of the most obscure questions in history, and for the historian of culture, one of the most central, is the very phenomena that brilliant fashion designers, a notoriously non-analytic breed, sometimes succeed in anticipating the shape of things to come better than professional predictors. I don't know who he thought who are the professional predictors, but this is kind of a shocking statement for, I think, most architects or fashion designers. To confuse further the system, someone like Rem Koolhaas, who really looked for the world of beauty in 1990, or for what might be very attraction in terms of aesthetics. I remember looking at an exhibition of this social housing in Fukuoka in Japan by Rem Koolhaas, by Oma, and there were endless faxes at the time in the 90s of him insisting on the black strip around the block. And if it won't be in this material, it might be black with this material, and kind of endless comments about the aesthetics of his architecture. 2011, this building should be finished, where he took the diagram and turned it into a building, what Colin Rowe would have called the appearance of the impeccable logic. And I think that's quite shocking, in my view. Because architecture can be like Zwiehäcker, can become a cultural critique, as this building in Tel Aviv, where Zwiehäcker was really draw a critique on the Tel Aviv bourgeoisie kind of taste, and use materials that are in a sort of very low, cheap kind of pavement and sort of very cheap materials. He built an apartment block for the well-off. Or Lebbeus Woods, where he used metaphors for healing, and or Gaetano Pesce, who comes with figurative kind of expression to make it clear to to communicate with larger number of people, where Peter Cook, like using jollier metaphors, like designing a tower, which is like a club sandwich, or art museum, which they call it a friendly alien, which reflect on one's world, on the way each one of us, or him, understanding the world, where personal attitude is kind of leading ingredient in the making of architecture. And Gehry, in the conversation, Frank Gehry states, not imposing yourself means you have to modify your feeling to a lower level of expression, but he might talk about it later. Will also, from England, maybe less familiar in LA, say the only thing we have is really other individualities, so what's the point of not bringing it in? I found the Caltron building in LA really captures something of the culture of LA, of the Angelino culture. Or if one look at Eric Moss' world and the Gnostic voice that he's talking about, and the role of the way we bring our private world to the public, is something which is leading in one's work. And in my work, the very last few years, in my work, I try to bring beauty in. I know that beauty might not be agreed as a way of generating architecture, or a way of arriving at architecture. But working with students, or in my work, I kind of look at a setting, and I thought, actually, we might call it depthscape appearance, where special depth, quality, and effect, which are explored, are becoming architectural condition, which came maybe as a kind of an impulse, or as an opposition to the topological surface or continuous volumes that we see so much around. So and it's very much coming from my intimate landscape and my knowledge base as an architect. And funnily enough, I was working with that, looking into my own work, but looking around kind of 2 years later and interviewing all these architects, and we can identify the depthscape appearance as a style of another short decade, suggested by individuals for other to experience, as you see Lebbeus and Hernan's work. So that's it. That's just an introduction. And so I would like the panel to come to the stage and have a seat. And just tell it to. Can you hear me? No?
Can't see any.
Is it on?
It's the idea.
The TS. Okay, I can't see your faces, but you'll hear my voice, I hope. Right. So as you might get from my kind of short introduction, and I think my first question is really, and obviously, about the role of the I and the I, what I call self-expression, and or the self. And I would like to start with Frank Gehry. You were a target of a lot of hostility because you were always very clear about self-expression and the way it generates your work, and led to it all the way
Why
through.
do you think I was so clear?
In our conversation, you were very clear, and I think maybe the clarity came with years of kind of standing up there against quite a lot of hostility
What
to
was
do
the
with
question?
self-expression.
Tell me the question again. I'm getting old, so I forgive me.
Right. Why do you think self-expression is an important thing?
Well, I said it in that thing that you printed, that I've always been taught by my parents from childhood not to talk down to anybody. So when I got into this field, I carried that with me. And I thought it also meant that any expression one made should not talk down to anybody. Now, that meant if I was thinking something and I wanted to contribute the best thing I knew how, that I would not disguise it in some way. I would just say it and get it over with. The nice thing about that is if you're open to it, people can disagree, and you can think about what they're disagreeing about. In most cases, those first thoughts that you might have about projects and things are difficult to explain to anybody, so that and they become very personal, and so that it's hard to listen to anything because you realize the person usually hasn't the roadmap to what you're doing, and so they don't completely understand it. They can react, of course, and they have a right to react, and the reaction is important, but as the person who made the statement, it takes a while to hear those reactions, or to filter them to a meaningful relationship to what you think you're doing. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
How was that?
Eric, you wrote your book, Gnostic Architecture, and I remember you told me that you were really upset at the time, mentioning Graham Colla's book, Small, Large, Medium, Extra Large, that has a kind of huge success, and quite, and your book got a kind of quite reception, and you said that the critique at the time said that your book was too private, and the whole point was that you wanted to talk about the private world and how it so much relates to your architecture, to the you call it the integrated compass of an architect.
Did I say that?
What?
Did I say that? I think what interested me, maybe going back to very early stages, I think I've always felt a little bit orphaned. And so this may be a psychotherapeutic problem more than a design problem. And I think at the time that book was done, the Gnostic architecture book, when we worked on it and when it came out, and I think the response to it was disappointing to me. And I think disappointing because the reading was that it was too opaque and not particularly accessible and not recognizable as something that could cheerlead a movement or galvanize a movement. But
Is that what you were trying to do?
no, but I think I wanted somebody to come along. We get it a little bit, and maybe this is a little bit schizophrenic, in a sense that what I wanted to do was both be an orphan, but I think I was interested that the point of view would be acknowledged and would be understood, if not sympathized with, because I think it's in there somewhere. And I think that sort of inaccessibility is a kind of I don't think I've been able to unravel that, really.
But I was, Tom, you wanted to respond to that?
You were discussing the I and the I.
Yes.
And because I think what Eric's talking about is the importance of the self, right? And this relationship. It's funny, I would have come at it a considerably different way. When you were discussing deconstruction and parametrics, I would have said that the aspects you were talking about were technique, and that you chose deconstruction, but you could have talked about a shift in the 80s of operational strategies, and I would have said that would have been much more powerful, and it directly talks about the topic we're talking about, because it's strategic and tactical, and that with autogenerative techniques, etc.
But it was not the language
that
of the
one more
time.
and more relied on a process of investigation to produce the thing that you're investigating, and one neither knew its look, its physiognomic, where it was going. You worked on that idea, and it absolutely put the self and the I into a more complex dialogue with the strategy itself, and it was hugely shifted a large number of architects and how they worked, and it was clearly assisted with parametrics and aided with the computer, which now was something that was absolutely connected to that.
It
broader
clearly
idea.
assisted, but the parametric guys say that it's not to assist anything, because the I and the I were removed. So in your psychology, it was the parametric really assists something, but they will debate here.
But with the development of an approach to work which is connected to a broader process, the eyes become something that's discriminating as you're making continual decisions of moving in one direction or another, because you're in dialogue with this operational strategy. But it makes it a much more of a relational thing than the power of the line, the authority of the line, the authority of the traditional way of developing architecture through drawing or modeling or whatever. It's a completely different kind of approach, I think. No?
Sure. Yes and no,
Certainly,
because
this group would quite differentiated in that sense, I would think.
For example, I don't know, Greg, you with the process you went through, you also had a kind of psychological shift from, let's say the early 90s to, you were admitting it, you were talking about it, to today. And it will be interesting actually to listen to your attitude and how you felt that was developed along the time.
Well, it's my nature to be contradictory. I mean, I know that about myself.
I think all the architects here have this nature.
Okay, but so
it's
for
it's
me,
a very basic impulse.
But for me to express myself, I always find it useful to express myself against something. And in the 80s,
It's the incentive of most architects, I'm being told.
yeah. I mean, I remember when I went to graduate schools, I luckily got into, I had a lot of options, and I really wanted to go to the AA or Cranbrook because I thought those were more interesting places. And then I went to visit Princeton, which was filled with postmodernists, and the students even were wearing bow ties. And I thought, I'm going to rip this place apart. And so that's why I went there. And I really couldn't say, for myself that there's always self-expression and there's a desire to express myself, but always against something. And back then in the 80s, it was, a dominant style which said that by looking at history, you could repeat certain historic principles, but really more a historic style. And so my look towards geometry and mathematical models and all that stuff was really to say, look, Borromini was doing this stuff. It wasn't a stylistic thing. It was really a debate about how to use a compass. And Bernini and Borromini were having a big fight about vaulting. And it really, for me, was against something. And I still think I personally like times where there's a dominant style. And I said this in Sweden, I don't really think today there's a dominant style. I think it's maybe difficult.
Why do we need it? Why do we need a dominant style in the 21st century where
Because
we
then it's
crave
easier
for
to
worlds of pluralism? And
Just make your life
because
easier.
it's easier to express yourself against something that's coherent.
So
It's very
Greg
hard
can
to
have a
express
career.
yourself in a vacuum where there's no handles. So
But you have to be careful. You're not the one who's coherent. Otherwise, you wind up fighting yourself.
And that's your domain.
Yep. It's true.
no, but that's why Patrik wants one very clear style, that it will be parametricism through the whole 21st century, just like as he thinks modernism was through the whole 20th century, which is a lie, of course. But
I think we're worrying about Patrik a little bit too much.
we should be scared by
I
that.
don't know why he's a good guy. He's making everybody a little bit nervous.
No, I'm nervous for a long time before Patrik expressed his ambitions.
But your instinct is to be nervous. This has nothing to do with
No,
Patrik.
I was nervous from the 90s when Greg Lynn got his kind of first breakthrough. It worries me, and that's why I'm very happy that Greg is here to kind of talk about it, really, because it's not, you said like that when you finished being a student, you opted for working for Peter Eisenman because you wanted to see how systems work, how, it's not about self-expression, and how someone with no eye, like Peter Eisenman, can kind of devise the systems and working. So it was not just, your impulsive, or ambition to follow your impulse and to be contradictive, to kind of shine out. There was something much deeper than that. And I think that kind of dichotomy between the rational and irrational thinking in architecture is a very actually meaningful one. It's a very important one. And Tom, you look worried, but I
mean, it
want to
might be useful for the audience to know who didn't hear that talk the other night. Patrik is employed with Ms. Hadid's office and seems to be on a kind of messianic mission to homogenize architecture as a sort of Pied Piper of parametrics, and makes a sort of Fidel Castro 3-hour, with charts and so on, like Charlie Jenks used to make. It was actually fascinating in terms of his belief in what he says, and there's not a scintilla of insecurity in it. He's so convinced.
But if you look at Zaha's early planning models, like that project for Singapore,
Yep.
it's a pretty homogenized idea that builds a city with no room for any other expression other than that, right? So she put the model on the table a long time ago. I didn't think she was serious, but
Well, but he is.
Peter, you're itching to say something.
Well, I think I'm going to play the Englishman as I usually do, and up against this
That'll be hard.
hot company. And I think that I've always thought that architecture was bullshit. You see, I mean, I think it's the most wonderful bullshit, and I'm a priest of the bullshit. But it's basically it's bullshit. Most of it can't be supported, and if somebody tries to tabulate bullshit, it's a bullshit of a bullshit. It's lovely. Now, the thing is, I think so. I've got a little prepared piece for this evening. I'll admit it, and I'll do it now. Otherwise, I might not get a chance. Which is that I was thinking, what was the original bit of state mental stuff, which was right back in Vitruvius. You know, there's a very nice, handy bit of Vitruvius that we were all taught in even Bournemouth first year, which is, you know, architecture's firmness, commodity, and delight. And I thought about that, and I thought, well, now, wait a minute. There's an element of, how can we relate this to beauty? Because you've got the sort of static firmness, which is an obvious thing. You've got sticking to your guns type of firmness. You've got kind of the ecstasy of the extreme, which is still a kind of firmness. And then there's that kind of Dracula blood-dripping kind of firmness. Like, you've stuck to your extreme so much, there's a great delight in it. There's a sort of beauty of the vicious. Maybe we won't mention Patrik. Commodity, you start with commodity then. You know, functionalism was the thing that people like me were all taught. Or it's the sort of commodity of the job well done, you know, the sort of slightly holier than thou thing. Or, you know, the commodity fits like a dream. And again, the salivation stuff fits like a dream. Superb. You know. The architectural equivalent of puffing up one's chest. Puffing out of chest is related to the same salivation that you get when the word beauty in certain cultures is mentioned. And then, of course, you have delight. And then we're close in, because what we haven't talked about, or you talked about, but we almost dare now we're hovering around morality, beauty, ethics and stuff. We don't talk about aesthetics. Well, you did, but we haven't mentioned it. And not the sort of procedural aesthetic which we got from a certain person, but the smile on the face aesthetic, something that you say, wow. And when your face lights up, that to me is beauty. That is the feeling of beauty. And I think that I think that all aspects of architectural bullshit, all not just tabulations, but even the things that people like me believe in for 10 years and then start to question. As soon as you start believing in them, you say, yeah, but, you know. And I think that is very inherent, I would dare to say, a very inherited English thing. If you look at all English humour, a lot of English writing, as soon as something is established, we are an offshore island. The philosophies were established onshore.
Maybe in the scientific world, that also makes the architects very insecure. Because they all
But
feel
I don't
it's
mind being
bullshit
insecure.
anyhow,
I'm insecure.
so-
I like being insecure. Do you follow me? It's much more exciting than being secure. Much more interesting. You never know what's going to happen.
The scientific world isn't that secure.
That's right.
Yeah.
So,
Maybe.
But the architect's interpretation of the scientific is kind of different.
oh, but I've been talking to neuroscientists. They've been coming around trying to figure out how I do it, and and they want to know whether it should be what people think of square or round. You know, they're very focused on it. I said, why don't you get out in space a little further and ask why we need it at all? Why does the human being need to go to look at paintings, or spend money to take the family to see the Parthenon, or go to a Mahler concert, or even think about art? Why do they need it? Is there a need in the DNA of human beings that and it seems there is, and it would be interesting to really get that point straight, and then we would have a reason for doing something.
But beauty is fairly limited. The cheerfulness, Peter, okay, so we got it. But we could certainly start a conversation that it's, I would have said it'd be much more interesting if it's somehow inquisitive. Painting, piece of music, piece of architecture, that it somehow instills you to think differently, to perceive differently, to understand the nature of the human character.
Well, I think that
et cetera,
is
et
the
cetera.
scientific imperative, really, is that we are inquisitive. We look, we're asked questions. We want to look at things, and I think that's the
But it could be
roadmap.
not at all
That's-
beauty. It could be actually quite uncomfortable. It can be. I would have said huge amount of work today would have
But
to
I
be
think
loaded
that
with
questioning
conflict
is
and
what
problematics. et
what
cetera.
starts the ball rolling. Why we do it. Why this.
And what stops the ball rolling? Because it's interesting if it has to do with curiosity or looking into things, and as soon as you do that, it gets to be contagious, and then I think people stop looking and they start replicating, and when you wind up talking about beauty, what you saw is it turns into a linguistic problem instead of a visual problem or an experiential problem. It's a linguistic problem because then it seems to have something to do with somebody's definition, balance, harmony, equilibrium. I mean, the kinds of things that become very quickly formulaic. And I
Meaning
think
it
probably-
requires a continual evolving. It's dynamic.
It
it's kinetic.
has a tough time, and Schumacher, to beat him to death, actually I think is an example of that. Because if Frank is right, and what Zaha was doing was an experiment, and she didn't really quite mean it, or if she meant it, she never expected to see it. I think what he's doing is taking the inquisitiveness out of the discussion.
Right.
And replacing it with a rule system or a method. And as soon as you do that, it becomes something you can teach, and something you can learn, and something you can criticize, and something you can quantify. And as soon as you can teach it, somebody can learn it and memorize it, so the persona goes out of it. And then you get the Pied Piper of parametrics.
I think we've lived in, any of us who've hung around architecture schools and places like this, there are always those little creepy guys there. Somebody does something. Nobody knows what it is, and maybe half the people don't even realize it's there. But the little creepy guy is smarter. He's waiting for something that he can theorize. Now, and I've met many of them. Some of them don't get to be very well known. Some usually they disappear without trace, but the odd dangerous ones survive.
But we can't-
I know them because I've had millions of students. You can see the guy. He never says anything. He's there. The other guys are kind of falling on their face and getting mauled and pulled. But the little creepy guy's collecting. Suddenly he sees something that he can.
Is creepy a pejorative term?
Yes, in English it's a creepy. You know it is. Well, you and I surrounded by them. Anybody who
I'm
runs
creepy.
a school that has a few creepers in there. You think that. And they're creative. But if you're sufficiently cynical, if you think it's all bullshit anyhow, even the creepy guy, you can eventually get him. Because suddenly he becomes boring. It's very interesting to see both here and in the AA school that the stuff of the name that we won't mention again is, I think, just about to be on the wane.
That's your wish, but
No, but
It's
statistically.
not statistically. It's not true. What do you mean?
No, but
statistically?
the boring people will do it, but the interesting people have already got bored with it.
But you see, I wanted to understand more what the troubled relationship, and I think if it's beauty or the beautiful or sublime, I mean, it's to do with the world of aesthetics, and that's, I think, what worries me, and I think what brings, what worried me in the conversation of the digital architects.
But
who
the
are represented- sorry.
marketplace will decide, I think, right?
Yeah.
So I think, in case you haven't noticed, architecture that we're interested in is a very marginalized idea in this world we live in. Have you noticed that?
I am myself.
Why are you looking at me?
Last time I checked in my bank account.
Yeah. So it's.
But I think this notion of insecurity and curiosity, to me, is an interesting one in relation to many of the things, because part of the scientific or sociological and different time artistic, I think, is the power of architecture. I think part of the thing is architecture or architects always misunderstand when they're looking at. So when we look at science, we don't get it, or art or music. And in our interpretation or effects on sense of security, something interesting happens. So I think part of the ignorance combined with the curiosity introduce certain kind of breaking moments in the trajectory of anything. So I don't have any that much problem with the security of the discipline. And I think that's one of the reasons why we keep borrowing arguments or systems or logic that doesn't belong intrinsically to our field.
Well, the market.
I mean, the bad reading of philosophy in deconstruction, the bad reading of science in the 90s, the bad reading of sociology in late 60s and 70s.
Well,
and many of the ones are in this table present here.
the-
And I mean, I'm here for the minority action of the Hispanic community, so that's the only reason. So far, I haven't had a long career, so I'm not responsible for that
Politically
many
correctness.
misinterpretations, but I have my own. But I think that's part of the thing. It's kind of a misinterpretation of many of the things and how it translates to it. And I think you can read almost
So why do you think you should be an expert on philosophy?
I don't. At all.
Absolutely not.
So, I mean, Eric is the only one that is.
Well, I rest my case.
What was your case?
That misinterpretation is a good way to start to develop an original expression.
If Frank said a moment ago that the marketplace might decide.
Well, you could, I mean, you make it either it's a personal thing where you do your work and shut up and take the lumps that not everybody's going to like you and live with that. And if you can avoid sibling rivalry, which none of us can, if you can get out of that place where you just find your own sort of zen, self, whatever it is, that's probably a great place to be as human beings, because everybody else has gone through the looking glass, as far as I can tell.
I think it is, except if the marketplace decides.
No, but what happens is we do our work. You get involved. I mean, I'm a generational thing behind you guys, so I have a whole different sense about what architecture is, the dignity of it, and all that crap. And it doesn't have much meaning anymore. So, and I think that people, if you do something that's expressive, then in times of economic stress, downturn, you can't do that anymore, because that's flaunting riches, which isn't necessarily so. I've built Bilbao was $300 a square foot, so it wasn't flaunting any riches. I think that all gets mixed up in the as it's interpreted by press, by historians, by our brethren who figure out ways to knock you, cut the ground out from under you for some reason, who are looking for ways to do that. I think the best, at my age, I look back and the best thing is just do your work and shut up. A lot of artists, I know I have a lot of artist friends who are really great artists in LA that have never been published, never seen the light of day, probably won't in their lifetime. Maybe someday they will be talked about. But why haven't they been? They haven't been in some part because their own personalities don't allow them to stand out. They hold back. They hide from it. A lot of things. I think in the end it's got to be kind of a personal choice. You do it. I think all of us respond to the time we're in, the whole sustainability thing. Everybody at this table has dealt with that issue in their work from the day they were born in architecture. We just didn't talk about it the way it is now, but we all talked about it, and we all did buildings that respected that and respected the environment, and as we saw it, as we saw the need to respect it. So there's nothing you can,
But Frank,
if somebody looks at your building and says it's not green, what are you going to do?
But
I-
Frank,
so one
the
thing
danger,
that-
the danger is, just a second, is that when we take the notion of the self as for granted, there's actually a young generation today that believe that there's no place for the self. It's indulgent. And just to give example, if we leave this for a minute aside, Thom, when talking to you, said the great things about architecture is that there's so many contents. It's such a huge world of knowledge and dealing with so many things that kind of fascinates you. And when one talked to digital architects, and Lynn was one of them, for example, then they said there's no content. Content is fused to form. Content kind of evaporate. Is not there.
No, I never said that.
Oh, you said that. We recorded that. So
No,
anyhow, many.
I did not. No, like in the Jungle Project, it's a jungle project.
But you said that
Or the
actually
Korean
it's a
church,
kind of
it's
a
a Korean
secret.
church project.
It was a kind of a secret between you and McCarthy. Like
No,
the
I'm
metaphor of
running
the
around
jungle.
saying.
It was my claim that it's the content actually. But even if you move, if we won't talk just about you, if we all know very well, and that digital architects claimed again and again that there is no content. Mark Goldthorpe, for example, is one of them, and said that content is fused into form. There is no content. And when people dealt with the parametric sensibility, they were driven in a certain way, and there was no way to bring, the landscape. The
But this is,
context.
this is a
So-
critics.
so-
This is a critic's problem and a critic's need, and really is not helpful in a discussion like this among people who are trying to do this and making an effort to be understood in a slightly broader way. I know Greg reasonably well. We eat lunch fairly often. I wouldn't call him a digital architect at all. I think this is completely a misnomer, and I'm not sure
I'm a digital architect.
Well, we weren't talking about you.
I'm just digital. I
But,
don't qualify as an architect.
There was in terms of getting this out, there are two really helpful people in the history of this discussion over the years. One was a guy by the name of John Dreyfus, who was a critic and not doing promotion, but really understood something very essential about architecture, and I think in particular in Los Angeles, and in Los Angeles in counter-distinction to other things that were going on in the world. And the other was Herbert Muchamp at a certain point. And those kinds of people interpolating have something to say and could have something extremely productive to say in an exchange between more idiosyncratic characters who sometimes can't make, whose work is in...
But Eric, the critics, that's a whole different culture, right? And they are as different as we are different, right? And so it's interesting to get those different points of view from different people. I think you can't live or die by their words.
Nope.
You can try to understand it. You can try to learn from it. But there are these different positions, just like there are X number of philosophers in the history of philosophy.
But Frank, what about the typical situation where there's a smart, let's say, Korean developer reading the New York Times. I think that the position of the I don't want to call them critics or whatever they are, the position of listen to writers is very different from what it was even when I started out, because there are certain channels by which a packaged view of what's going on this table is then presented very easily, and there's some guy sitting there in a nice room reading, say, that's the guy we want to employ. It does happen much more than I think it did, and that territory of packaging is linked in a funny way with the creepy guy. It's another version of the creepy guys. Some of them are the same guys.
What difference does it make? I mean,
Well, it makes
it's
it if
going to
it goes out
happen
there.
anyway. I mean, there's nothing you can do about it.
No, because the dangerous
might
bit
as
is
well-
it's the creepers.
The what?
The creepers. These people who enjoy,
It's the guys in the helicopters.
it's these guys who enjoy turning what it really is.
I know, but I
to their
can't
advantage.
change what I'm doing because of that, right?
No, but
They
some
may-
guy
they
might
could-
build it or not build it because
Well,
of
they
that.
might not build it, but
But I think of the students.
over
I think
time,
of the
I
young
think
generation.
it could change the culture. Yes, it could. Like, what's his name? Drexler did when he did that show at Modern of Mozart stuff,
Yeah.
and it turned everybody around. But people are like lemmings; they fall into
Yeah, this-
those traps, and it's probably people that there were a few good things that came out of that, and one of them was pluralism. That it opened the doors to a lot of different people, which has been since that happened has been a great plus from that. So I don't think it's all negative. Like,
But this isn't a topic we can talk about, frankly. There might even be a critic in the audience. Come on, this is a much more complicated
There wouldn't be a-
conversation that we'll
no
have in
critic would
and
dare
have
to
in
come
private.
here tonight.
Can I ask a question that goes back to the topic of beauty? Because you said something that I completely disagreed with, which has a little bit to do with what Frank said a minute ago, having to do with an expressive notion of architecture at a particular economic time. You showed Rem at Fukuoka, and you were comfortable with his interest in materiality and the maybe
No, I gave it as an
phenomenology in that.
example of how he changes.
Okay, and then you
skin,
showed
yeah.
another piece, and it seemed to be somewhat critical. And I would have, I go, that's kind of interesting, because I would have said that's exactly what the topic is, and that we're looking at a definition, or we're looking at a phenomena of aesthetics or of beauty, a little more generic or simpler idea. And I would have said what took place there that's interesting is he shifted the location of his architecture, and it moved from one territory to another, and it clearly moved into something more conceptual, and it had very different interests than the first one. And the discussion isn't this is correct and this is incorrect, or I agree with one or I don't agree with the other. The discussion is, by the way, what are the specifics of that shift having to do with the location of the architecture and the method of thinking, because that's all we're talking about here is it's a method of thinking, right, of what we do. And that method of thinking is what connects us and disconnects us, right, always, and it leads to someplace.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing we finally look at is the manifestation of that process, right, and now has characteristics, because I would have said beauty is much more interesting as a descriptive term, not a term that we're really interested in as architects, that we have no choice, that it have happens normally, and most of us, I don't know, does everybody here think their work is beautiful? I would have questioned, I would have thought not. That it at times can be incredibly clumsy. I realized as a very young man, I became very influenced by James Sterling, and it was kind of startling to me, and I realized very early on that I actually liked his clumsiness, his absolute incredible lack of
But you see
facility.
that clumsiness,
and it
the
was
beautiful
exactly
thing about that
nature of the work
clumsiness
that I so much
is that
admired.
James Sterling never separated between the rational and the irrational, where Rem Koolhaas, the reason I show what I show about Rem Koolhaas is really this separation and opting for leaving the irrational behind.
But the
completely.
Hello represented a radical shift in his interest and his preoccupations, which is leading to a very different architecture, which has immensely different consequences within urbanistic terms, within ecological terms,
Sure,
within social,
sure.
cultural terms,
You know,
etc. And after that,
But
the conversation begins, right?
There's an interesting, again, playing to the audience a little bit, if Thom was just talking about awkward, I don't know, I wouldn't say Sterling to me looks polished in a way, matte, but not awkward, not clumsy. Maybe the Oxford thing.
The Oxford
but
Leicester,
I think,
Cambridge.
but I think awkward has a conceptual meaning. I think it means you're clumsy because you can't quite stand. You don't quite know how to do it, and maybe by the time you get to the end of the process, you might figure it out. And if you're prepared to work on something and not be so sure where it might land, and you might make a mess in the end. So awkwardness
But
isn't
what if you're awkward because you're responding to the world around you, which is very awkward. Everything is kind of
That's a different kind of
messy.
awkward, I think. Though.
Is it?
Why? Because I think the world around you so often seems to be so self-assured, and they know in a way, and
I
you.
know. Who's that? I never heard anybody.
Boy,
You mean the
everybody.
Tea Party, the Tea Party guys.
Yeah, they know too.
Tom, you
Anyway, I think here comes the creepy. But I think what interests me about that is clumsiness. It's not so much that it would emulate the world around it, although I guess that's a way to discuss it. I think it has to do with a kind of either insecurity, uncertainty you don't quite know, and you're in the process of trying to figure it out. That's tough to do with a building, with a schedule, with a budget, with a client. It's tough to say, geez, I really don't know. I'm not sure. Can we try this?
Yeah.
I mean, Yael, why isn't there anybody on this panel like John Pawson or David Chipperfield or Richard Meyer? I mean, because I think those people all do.
They weren't in town tonight.
Richard might
They
be.
don't live in LA.
But they all do beautiful work. And I don't mean that in a
So?
good way or a bad way, but I think they're very
I think
invested.
Chipperfield
You mean
work
it in
is
a bad
beautiful.
way.
No, I don't. I mean, but
I don't agree
there's
with
a-
you. I find it boring what they do. I don't find it exciting as
See, that's what I mean. It's all very personal. It all gets,
Okay, well,
You
that's why
see-
they're not here.
you
But-
see. I think
but
it's
they're
a slippery slope
self-expressive.
to discuss beauty. I think it's much more interesting to discuss the troubled relationship, or you escaped it already a few times, like the notion of content. Like Thom was so excited about architecture having so many contents to deal with, and you went on
Okay.
and on. But
there are
for you-
people like John Pawson that will talk explicitly about beauty and refinement and his self-expression. I mean, he sometimes talks even in the third person about the beautiful things he's finding and designing. But so that's why, I personally
Okay,
am
but
not in
so-
that project.
so if the marketplace likes that,
Yeah.
what are you going to do about it?
Well, the little luxury part of the market likes it.
Well, some of them do.
But I think at the end, it's not really more about sensibility than anything else, because when you were talking about Stirling and clumsy, now, the thing came clumsy because lack of control or refinement is one thing. If you're doing clumsy on purpose, you're developing a very particular way to develop conditional sensibility. Part of the problem is where I think people in this table have a problem to talk about beauty, or the beauty with capital B. It have to do with the kind of a memory cultural implication of beauty that achieved many years. So if you are into develop a different alternative or awkward or clumsy sensibility and so on, it requires a certain amount of time to be categorized, to absorb in terms of what society and culture will understand in those terms. So to me, at the end of the day, the discussion is not really so much about beauty or beautiful. It have to do with the development on a particular way to approach a relation, the body of work with the interaction with the context and the larger context. So to me, again, if you do clumsy after clumsy, well, that's a sensibility. It's not that you're that bad. Or
Or you're a slow learner.
that is another way to talk about it. But what I'm saying is, I don't think anybody in this table or many of this audience would admit that they will do beautiful work. You say, Thom, but secretly nobody's trying to do anything ugly or horrendous on purpose. Neither. Everybody is developing a kind of an internal logic and trying to communicate with something else. And in that negotiation, eventually some other qualities can start to emerge.
I think whether she realized it or not, Yael's aim, and I do know the lady rather well, her aim was to get us out of our comfort zone. I think any system that gets people who, you know, to the outside world are fairly good at what they do or comfortable with what they do, to get to the edges of the comfort zone is intrinsically interesting. And if I can just make a comment on Sterling, one of the intriguing things about the way he taught, particularly when he was in Dusseldorf, was he drew little maneuvers. I mean, I've seen these sheets of Sterling crits. Little maneuver, he was shuffling. I think he was an old English shuffler. He shuffle, and then, you know, the building had to get built, and it's still shuffling. It's still wanting to, and that's something which is a very particular sort of quirk, if you like, or tick. But I think what's intriguing, I think there should be far more books, whether they start from the proposition of beauty or anywhere else, and whether they include, you know, because the reason why Yael finds Chipperfield, for instance, boring is because he seems to be very comfortable, but that's another issue. But I think any book that starts to edge us out of our corners is of interest, because out there's always the cause and effect thing. People are intrigued as to what makes you tick. And if the question makes you uncomfortable, and makes you serially uncomfortable, because as soon as you get any of us on a platform, we're even starting to be uncomfortable with each other. That surely is positive. It's the opposite of the demagogic, we must all do this thing.
I mean, I met David Chipperfield when he hadn't built anything. He was just a young architect in London, and we put him on a team with all of us. And he was very uncomfortable and very nervous about his role and what he was going to do. And over time, he's found a way to accommodate himself in the culture and use whatever his personal strengths to become the David Chipperfield he is. And I don't know him well enough now to know about his comfort or discomfort. He's figured out a way to exist, to make his work, to be proud of it, he's got pride cues about it, I feel. He's not selling himself down the river. He's trying to do buildings that his clients ask him to do, and he's found a niche where that works. And
Chipperfield continued the world of modernism, and that's why it's not in the book.
You know, it's real. That's him. I don't like it or dislike it. I think it's just what's happened is there's the freedom in our culture for all of us to express ourselves and to find our ways to manage it and find work and do things within that. And you know, we do belong to schools in a way, some of us. I mean, probably this group here are more simpatico with each other, but that doesn't mean we're right. It means, or that we know everything. I mean, we've all got our own education. You know, I think we're all learning. We all spend time reading. We all spend time listening to music. We all spend time looking at art. We all spend time listening to crazy politicians. And some people look to the Bible for meaning. Some people look to philosophers. Some people look to art. There's so many different categories of thinking, and you can't categorize them. I think this group is very free-spirited and has enjoyed that, and some people like it and some people don't. But
see, for me it was interesting.
I think supporting each other is great. I think this is great, but
I think for me, I mean, we didn't have the chance to listen to Greg because somebody came into your conversation, but talking about the digital architects, and I think a lot of students, not only here in London, wherever in each city, are very influenced by the attitude of what I call digital architects and what the way they define themselves. And I think Greg was a leading figure in the beginning of that conversation, and I think it will be interesting to listen to why he had a shift in his view.
I don't think you're going to survive in our world of architecture unless you understand the digital processes and incorporate them into your work.
Sure.
The aircraft industry built an airplane.
I'm not questioning that
They
at
built
all.
an airplane paperless. The 777 airplane was built paperless. The fact that that could happen has a tremendous impact on all of us. We don't.
Sure.
If you don't look at it, you're missing the point.
And I think in the...
I don't mean that anyhow. It's
No, I'm not against it.
No. It's not against or pro. It's not pro or cons. I think it's. I don't mean that. I mean there's a whole group of many young architects who define themselves as digital architects, and then it has a certain attitude that it presents. And of course, every architect in the world today uses computers, so we can say that we're all digital architects. But the way you can define, or Hernan can define it, or Greg can define it, is when it started, let's say in the 90s, it was the notion of doing a drawing and then fabricating the drawing, and there was a certain way of, there was a certain attitude that came with that. And as I said, there was kind of no content, the self was removed, there was a whole, it came with a whole set of conversation with it. And to kind of ignore that and say that, it's not part of the conversation, it's part of the discussion at the AA, it's part of the discussion of Patrik, he's not by himself there, it's part of the discussion of many. And I think that was for me another kind of worrying thing. Of course the computer serves us all, but I made a kind of definition. I think Greg is very familiar with that. And you were sitting in many quits, and if it's a DAA or DRL or sure you are familiar with what I'm talking about, and many publications of performative architecture, of emergent architecture, of different kind of titles that were given to many group of architects who claim that there is no place for the self and removing the self and all of that. I think, Greg, I wanted you to talk about it because you went through a certain kind of change and in an attitude with an attitude. So I thought it might be interesting to.
Well, it's I'm going to have to repeat myself only because to go back in time, there was no way to express yourself in the late 80s and early 90s with a computer. Unless you wanted to pick it up and break it or something, but nobody knew how to use it. And I remember very profound two things that had nothing to do with architecture, but I saw these Ford Tauruses around. And I thought, that's kind of a new looking car. It has no articulation, no seams, no flares, it just looked really weird and blobby. And I thought, that's, odd, I wonder why. And I started asking around. They said, it's the first car designed with a computer. And the designers don't know how to put a crease on it or a break form. They don't know how to even make a fillet. They could just make kind of a big egg. And so... and I realized, and I also, I don't know why. I was trying to learn how to be an architect and fetishy about materials, and I went to Bigelow's Pharmacy in New York to get a horse bristle toothbrush because I thought plastic ones were bad, and I then went to the grocery store and saw a whole aisle of toothbrushes, and they all looked kind of different. And coincidentally, I saw a magazine about toothbrush design, and it said this is an AutoCAD toothbrush, and this was a Maya toothbrush, and this was a that toothbrush. I went back, and you could really see the signature of the software. And so I thought, well, either I'm going to end up just doing stuff that looks like the software, or I'm going to learn how to use the software so I can have a position to it. And back then, what I was always saying was, you can see the signature of the software. And I wasn't saying, well, go be the signature of the software. I was saying figure out how to use the equipment so you're not just doing what the software tells you to do. So you're doing something with it. But I would never have walked up to the computer and said, okay, I'm going to express myself, like, and start yelling at it or something. I mean, you have to figure out how to use it. And so that puts you in a dialogue. And for me, that's what the whole digital architecture thing is. And I mean, now in cars and planes and all this stuff, you see designers again.
I get a feeling that what your aspiration is hasn't happened yet.
No, we're still all
That
amateurs.
it actually, it's coming. I mean, it may be a while, because I think we still belong to a different pro forma, notwithstanding the tools. And I also have a sense from your point of view, Yael, a critical point of view. You're talking as a kind of architecture insider. And I think what you really need in a discussion like this is, which you don't get very much, and maybe Herbert was a little bit like that, somebody like Mumford, who would look at it over a long, or in a different way, somebody like Jacob Burckhardt, look over a long distance and actually deliver a perspective on what might be going on, which doesn't belong to an insider's view, school to show to magazine to newspaper and so on. It requires some kind of distance, and it requires some kind of separation. And that's why there aren't very many people like that who can actually say where these things fit. And I think what Greg said is actually of some interest to me, that he didn't want to give the software back to itself, which means the legibility of the software, which is still very present in some contemporary work. I would say Hernan is an interesting example of that, a useful example. Whether you could get outside of the obligations of the software. So this I think, the hypothesis is it's coming. It may come out of somebody here, or it may come out of somebody who's not born yet. But I think that's another step which you can look forward to.
But the point is that it's inevitable. Somebody will figure it out.
Yep.
That's the point I want to make, that it's coming.
Yep.
And somebody's going to do it. And he's probably as close to it as anybody I know.
Any question for the audience?
I think we should just end right there.
On that note, with the benediction.
Yeah.
Somebody wants to ask a question.
Hi, I'm from the same island as Peter, and I'm one of the creepy guys. And I wrote about aesthetics and defending it, attacking it, so I'm kind of interested. And I wanted to raise a moment that happened at the AA a few years ago when Peter Eisenman and Rem Koolhaas were in discussion. And I kind of disagree with Yael's interpretation. In fact, what was interesting was that Peter Eisenman was kind of saying to Rem the whole time, but your buildings are beautiful. They're really beautiful. And Rem was very unhappy, very uneasy to get this kind of accusation in a way. And in a way, certainly in the AA culture, there was this kind of thing where people, I mean, Foreign Office architects also would have this kind of view that, people working in the office, we all know our buildings are beautiful, but we don't want to admit it. And there's kind of like a repression of addressing that question, which goes back in history. Adolf Loos was in the same situation. Of course, Adorno makes this comment that actually his buildings are incredibly sensuous, so I don't know why he's trying to pretend they're all about function. And in fact, if you go back to Vitruvius, I mean, the term that Vitruvius used, Venustas, doesn't mean beauty, it means charm. And if you look at the ways he defends, talks about beauty, it's all moral terms. Alberti too, about appropriateness, becoming, and so on. And there's been this kind of incapacity to address beauty, which almost seems like a form of repression. I mean, the one guy I know who can talk about beauty very easily is someone Nigel Coates. I think kind of often in gay culture, there's absolutely no problem talking about beauty. So I think it's kind of there. It's that people are kind of often repressed about it and don't want to admit it. I mean, even the guys who are incredibly interested in performativities and so on. You look at the ADs that come out about performativity, it's always suspicious that the illustrations are exquisitely beautiful. So it seems to me like it's there, but repression is part of the logic of it.
It takes an Englishman to understand the business of embarrassment.
Are you one of the creepy guys?
Are people asking questions now? Is that where we are?
Well, I mean, one thing is probably every era has its own particular kind of beauty. I mean, we were in Sweden, and after 2 days of conferencing, this first question was a student that stood up and said, "Well, isn't beauty just something that's easy on your eyes?" And I thought, I give up. Like, that's like the stupidest thing I ever heard. You know, that may have been beauty at one time, or maybe you need beauty that's easy on your eyes at one time, but you know, I think in culture, that's not what my ear is listening to in music. It's not what I'm looking for in art. It's not.
How about in sex?
Easy? No, not easy. Not easy on your eyes.
Well, it doesn't hurt.
No, but I just think it's very hard to talk about beauty so generically because every moment has its own definition of what's beautiful. And you're right. I think everybody said it. You don't always know it. I mean, I remember at one of these INI conferences, I showed these embryological houses, and Peter Eisenman, again, who I think is very aesthetic, kept saying, which one's the good one? How do you pick? If you can't pick, then you can't have a beautiful one. And if you can't have a beautiful one, what the hell are you doing?
But whose beauty? It's culturally specific to start with.
Yeah.
What makes it such a difficult topic?
But I think, in relation to Neil's comment, I don't think it's not that people will not admit that they're after something beautiful. I just think it's not probably at the forefront of their head when they're doing the work. I think you just focus on other things and you're trying to figure it out. Sense of refinement, the sense of articulation, other things that you will hope that it will build to something that it may have that quality or not. But I'm not so sure. I mean, as Greg pointed out, it's hard to define if what you produce, when you're doing, will have that quality or not. I mean, it's almost you lose perspective on your own work at least.
But
when you think it, then the consequences of that. I mean, for example, I will make a clear distinction. I would argue, in any case, if I'm interested in beautiful, if I'm interested in that, I'm more interested in the problem of beautiful than maybe beauty, which I associate beauty with a kind of a much more classical understanding of the problem. With beautiful, to me, is much more moment. Is kind of the momentum, it's temporary, has to do with sensuality and other things. So that I can relate a little bit more, but I think also you have a much shorter life. And maybe what you negotiate in your own terms have to do with that kind of a temporality, and I think then it becomes too heavy of a burden to keep working on it. I mean,
it's not helpful, I think, at this point. And if you want to talk about the term, or you want to talk about the definition of beautiful, if you look at the history of ideas over a long period of time, you can see points in time where there's a consensus. The consensus now seems to be the opposite, that there's no definition, that you don't know, that it's personal, that it's private, that it's moving, that it's evolving, and therefore to insist on it being something and excluding something else seems to be not very useful. But if you were sitting around, I don't know, with Raphael or something, they had probably an agreement about criteria which was acceptable within a certain range, and you didn't see too much deviation from that range. So I think when somebody asks the question, so this again may be a psychotherapeutic problem, there's a need to do what Schumacher is trying to do. The question is to codify everything, make it beautiful. Tell me what's beautiful. Please tell me what's beautiful. Then I'll know what to do. Otherwise, I don't know. Tell me what's beautiful, I'll know how to evaluate it. Otherwise, I don't know how to evaluate it.
But
But that's the
Also, it's
result
not
of
completely true. There are certain consensus about what constitutes something beautiful at any given time. I mean, I can tell you, if you ask, most of the people won't agree who are the ideal for certain women or men at any given time in history, and we can define who are considered. So there are certain things. There are more options now. There are more variables, so perversities are more acceptable. So it creates more options, but it's not completely true that there are not really any kind of criteria. I mean, there are certain buildings and architects and
I'm
paintings
really
and movies
saying that
and music.
the need to insist
define, I agree with you.
on a
Defining,
criteria,
yes.
and so if it's not everything that's possible, there are quite a range of things that are possible, and in working, it's not really necessary to say, okay, this is the beautiful, that's my aspiration. Who
it's
does
the-
that? This is
But,
not-
it,
the
but it's
question
the
is
opposite
not-
of homogenizing it. It's the opposite, because beauty is uncontrollable. It's the opposite. And I think whereas Patrik was talking about removing the self, it's when the homogenizing comes in. And I think that's what, for me, is interesting to
No, but it's
discuss.
not that it's not
But-
controllable, but it's controllable one architect at a time. It's not collectively controllable.
Right, but that's more interesting, because
Yeah,
then
but you're
if we-
Okay.
If
But it's not
Patrik-
the architect. It's the cultural differentiation of the whole notion of beauty. You're discussing. I agree with you totally. You have to have a constituency, and it came from a localized, homogeneous culture that can make an agreement. And we now live in a globalized, radically heterogeneous world. And it removes this discussion as a broad topic, and it makes it extremely private. And it's not something that we can rely on as a broader conversation, because it immediately looks at whose beauty, which culture, because it's absolutely culturally specific. And so there'd be no way of even being interested in finding an agreement. It's not even important to find an agreement. In fact, there couldn't be an agreement just based on our acceptance of the global condition and the
what you-
heterogeneity within that
Then
condition.
if I wasn't at Patrick's thing, but if what they're saying
And I
is true, then he'll fail because of what you just said,
Yeah.
right?
Absolutely. It's kind of a hopeless endeavor, I think, is really what it is. It's totally hopeless.
I mean, I vote for arousal versus beautiful. I think arousal is more useful in the long run. Hey, there's a line of people there.
With questions?
Oh my God.
Last assailing question.
Guys,
How many knots of wind we got?
yeah,
How many knots of wind out there for tomorrow?
not so windy. I just wanted to ask if there was if you guys saw a difference in terms of whatever this broad understanding of beauty, elegance, uncomfortableness. If there's a difference between the artifacts that we produce as architects, the models, the drawings, the renderings, and the wares that we kind of show to one another and not necessarily to the civilians out there that think we're really a bunch of nuts for producing this stuff and not concentrating on the buildings, and whether or not there's a difference and how you guys sort of see that between the things that we imbue in the things we produce for one another as architects, or we produce specifically not with them being as objects that'll go into buildings. Does that make any sense?
Well, I mean,
I don't know, what do you mean?
one thing, I mean, the nightmare scenario is starting a project and having somebody say, I saw this thing and I just want one of those. Or can you just do that thing again, just a little bit different? You know, and that's a very different thing than
No,
saying,
but some people accept that.
no, for sure, for sure. And there's another kind of a relationship where you say, somebody says to you, I've got a problem. You know, I need to express something and I'm not sure what it is, and we're going to start off figuring out how it works. And I think that's where all these tools of drawings and models and renderings, they play, more of an exploratory role, let's say, than a role like an image. And I think too often people, like, I really agree, Frank, when you say you don't want to talk down to people. I think too often some of those things get used that way. And also so does the whole process argument, like the library is based on a Dewey Decimal understanding of space. It's like, you know, you could see the stack boxes and the second skin working through houses and opera, you know, concert halls and all kinds of stuff. So the media and the tools and the models play a role, and then I think the finding something new plays a role.
But I think the danger of the way we're talking about it is that you're not really in control. I mean, if you're working in the world of where you have a client, which is how we work, and the client has a site, and the client has a budget, and there's a context, and there's a building department, and there's all of those nice things that control most of the destiny of a project, and the times you're building in, and the culture you're building for. I've always felt that the margins of self-expression are pretty small compared to the bigger picture, and that no one individual's work or self-expression is going to bring down the world in any way. It's not gonna hurt anybody, and the areas we work in are so small compared to the global construction industry. We're pretty small parts of it. So why not, if you have ideas, why not try to express them? Why not, if clients are willing to discuss it, as long as you are responsible to the craft, so to speak, to you're part of a service business. You're not making art to hang on the walls. You're doing things for specific purposes and specific places. You have to respect all of that. And so why not differentiate? Why not allow these differences of how you put those together exist and support it? Support it because it's such a small piece of the puzzle. I think that most of the buildings that are built are not architecture. What percentage is that? 98.2%, maybe more.
But for some reason, architects working in that manner frighten people.
They do? We frighten people?
Absolutely.
Oh.
You haven't found that?
Well, I guess so, yeah. But in my case, I don't see what else I could do. So, I do it. I get called every once in a while. I don't self-promote, although everybody thinks I do. Probably. I haven't got a publicist. I don't take pictures of my own buildings. I don't go out looking for work. I wait till they come and hit me on the head.
Don't you think that active, just free thought, forget the design part, just thinking freely and engaging in a problem freely and openly is maybe, particularly at this time of history, just frightens a lot of people. Instantly.
Well, it shouldn't, because it's such a small piece of the
status quo.
Sarah Palin frightens me, but this is a different kind of fright, right? So the magnitude of our frightening work is very small, and it's people can select it or not. You're not forcing yourself on somebody, are you?
But it frightens them enough to keep a large part of this group in check, or fairly limited.
But that's the history.
Output.
That's the history of our profession.
All right.
But I think there's a very lovely thing about architecture, which I still find, that is a piece of architecture, a design of an architecture, can exist on, the moment at which I call the salivating moment can exist at different points for different people and under different circumstances. To some people, the salivation moment is when the scribble or the digital scribble, whatever it is starting to sing. And then it goes on in the process and gets built maybe, and quite frankly probably loses it. Or loses it to other people, it doesn't exist till it's there. And there are all sorts of stages of this, buildings that were half built, never built, slightly built, gleams in the eye, an idea of an idea. The second version is, like back to Stirling, there were 3 or 4 museums of which one of them got built. But probably one of the other ones was the better one, who knows? And I think that that's what makes it so fascinating. We attempt to have a consistent discussion or a consistent point of departure or a consistent set of values. But the really good thing about it is that it exists at every level. And that's why I get sometimes, again, worried about the creepy who is able to communicate rather strongly with the people who don't know but have got the money.
Okay, but what are you going to do about it? Shoot
Nothing.
'em?
Nothing. I can indulge in my own salivations.
You
Of
should.
course.
You
Which
should,
are different from yours and different at different
you
moments.
should go to self-promotion classes and figure out how to do it better.
But even if you did that, Frank, you'd know you were playing out a con, because what I'm really saying is that we creatively indulge, and that's a great strength. And we creatively indulge, and they creatively indulge, and the guy in the helicopter's creatively indulging at different moments, different times, at different projects. And that's what makes the whole business immense, wonderfully multidimensional. The value system is multidimensional. The moment of salivation can occur almost anywhere. And I find that still encouraging, despite what any of us might say.
Yeah, well, some people want to hire people to do that, right? Bilbao happened because the Basque culture, the president, the minister of culture, the minister of commerce, they all got together and they made a business decision that they needed something to jumpstart their world. There was a competition. Isosaki made something that was very quiet and minimal. Coop Himmelbau made something that was not comprehensible. They weren't quite ready to be in that milieu right then. And I made something that was scary, let's say. They made a business decision. They picked scary because scary paid off. That was purely a business decision.
But in retrospect, it paid off. It probably wasn't so clear at the time it was done.
They knew that the minimal wasn't going to do it.
They'd also tried it with a few other architects.
Yeah,
and
they
failed.
tried it. So whatever, I talked to the Minister of Commerce. He didn't have any real sense about architecture.
Maybe true, actually, not so much the fear factor anymore. It may be that the apprehension quotient is actually a little bit less now than it used to be, because what wasn't saleable about the rite of spring when people rioted in the street.
Right.
That's a fear factor in
Right.
a way. So it's not so clear now that architecture might
It took
have
years before Stravinsky was accepted.
That's right, but in the Bilbao sense, there's a marketability quotient, strangely enough. So what might create apprehension turns out to be there's a lot of plane rides.
No, but they had the model. They had the Sydney Opera House in modern times, and then they looked at history of architecture. Buildings did. People do take vacations and go see buildings.
Well, I've also thought that it was very much part of the culture in the sense that I don't know what the films were exactly at that time, but they were all these computer-rendered monsters stomping around in cities. I mean, when you see the Bilbao in context with the street, it's real. It's not like Godzilla, but it's got that quality of something from contemporary culture materializing. And if you look at other designers, it became a reference point for all kinds of product designs and all kinds of stuff. It was really self-expressive, but it was also at the right time for culture to say, well, here's a physical version of something I've seen at other scales or in other places, and I think that's a really important thing. And it is tough on us, on this panel, most of us. Hernan, you're plugged in more personality-wise, persona-wise, but you know, this is the age of like Jersey Shore and The Bachelor and stuff. It's not the age of the blockbuster special effect film. No, and I really think that has something to do with it. People maybe aren't interested in that kind of stuff as much as they were 10 years ago.
No, and it's a time of small, incremental thinking. I was just whispering to Eric Stravinsky, it'd be a very different time. He went out that night and celebrated with his buddies and got drunk. He just like did it. Blew him away, right? Couldn't care less. In fact, it was a sign of success that he was rejected. Different time.
There is uncomfortably a recent biography of Diaghilev that suggests that he actually stirred it up. He actually organized the claque so to get more PR. Sorry about that.
Wow.
Shall we take one more question there? I think is it a queue to ask
One.
questions? Or?
Just do one, you know.
Yes.
They can arouse.
Beauty is a word that's hard to define, but it has an emotional content. What about budget?
Hard to define.
Well,
I'm not there even to try to answer that. I refer to
that's what I was talking about.
the successful ones.
Right?
How much
Did
you
you hear
got?
me talk about it?
Yes.
Okay. So that's my answer.
Well, you know what? One thing's for sure. Doing something that's culturally significant is never factored into the budget of any project, despite how much money it makes the clients. I mean, I tried to defer fees with the person who makes Hollywood deals, and I said in the contract, you know, why don't you just give me half the fee, and then when you sell the house, I just want to take a vig on whatever the increased value is, because I think I'll make it worth more. And I just got laughed at. Like, they already screwed over the studios. I'm not going to let that happen to the construction industry. So it is the one thing that's not in the budget that probably
but
should
we're
be.
not in control of the construction industry. The
Yeah.
architect is very infantilized in the construction industry. When we showed the models of Disney Hall to the board, the contractor that they all loved, Peck Jones, Jerv Jones came to my office with the group, and they all loved the model, and then they turned to him and said, "What do you think?" And he said, "Well, it looks pretty, but it's not buildable." Right? So at that moment, I would have lost, except I was ready for him, and I had a mock-up of the most complicated parts of the building already built. And so I took him downstairs and showed him that, and he backed off. But I think if you don't understand that your role in the project is to understand the budget, understand the reality of it, and make that a primary part of your effort, I don't think it's bad. I mean, those kind of even tight budgets lead to you can work within them and innovate and make things. And there are a lot of examples of that by a lot of us.
Wolf Prix would say that he gave an example that clients first want to be reassured that it's buildable. So they bring the engineer and it's question a lot. Is it buildable? It's new, it's different. Is it buildable? And then when he's convinced that it's buildable, he say, but are you sure it will be in budget? And when you work the budget out and you show that it's all in budget, and then the client say, you know what, I don't like it. As a kind of a third last.
They do say that?
It's Wolf
Oh,
Prix.
to Wolf Prix. Not to you.
withdraw. It's very freezing here. Thank you very much.